Okay, good morning, Cathy Walker in Surrey, BC, is what I understand. And here with Jane Armstrong in Toronto and Ken Lukart in Toronto. I'm Doug Miller from Montreal, and we're part of the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Activist History Project. And Ken and Jane in particular are interested in the SAC2 solidarity work from that period. And so we'd like to interview you, and we sent you a consent form that indicates your willingness to participate and you understand its conditions. So if you could just affirm verbally that you've read it and you agree to be interviewed.
Yes, I read the consent form and I agree to be interviewed.
Okay, lovely, lovely. I usually start with just a very broad question. If you could just give us a little bit of your own personal history, your own little your background in short, and how you got into A, unionism, and B, anti-apartheid work.
Well, I grew up a working class kid in Burnaby, which is a suburb of Vancouver. I went to SFU and got involved in the student movement and the women's movement, and then started working in factories in the Greater Vancouver area. Got involved in the union that way. And at that time, it was the early 70s, so there was lots of opportunity for growth. You know, there was a huge fight back by working people across the country, and certainly in the Greater Vancouver area. And the union expanded from one plant to 40, you know, not quite overnight, but within a few short years. Then I came on as a full-time local president, and then eventually as a national representative with my former union, Canadian Association of Industrial, Mechanical and Allied Workers, that eventually merged with the CAW in 1992. Then I went east.
And so through your unionism, is that how you became introduced to the issues of apartheid in Southern Africa? And
well, I think through the student movement, there was certainly an awareness, but in terms of actually talking to people who were completely involved in the South African situation, that was definitely through the union at a university where, of course, preoccupied with the anti-Vietnam War movement. That was probably our main international focus at that time. And, you know, opposing, you know, United Fruit in Central America and Latin America, you know, that sort of thing. But I don't recall doing much in the way of anything about Africa at that time.
okay, so and then you're in the union. I can't remember that long acronym, but it
Oh yeah, if you say CAIMAW,
CAIMAW.
which some people said was CAIMAW, because we were, a lot of us, sort of Maoists at the time. But CAIMAW works. Yeah.
Anyway, so there you are in the union, and now you, I guess, eventually meet SAC2 Solidarity Committee somehow. Do you have any recollection of how that all came about?
Well, how that happened, I don't know. It was definitely at their initiative. It was people like Ken and Jane. I'm trying to remember if I met you and Ken Trainer around that time. You know, I have a dim memory. Fortunately, Ken and Jane are much more adept at dredging up memories than I do. But, you know, it's sort of, then when you run into people, you know, years later, you sort of think, oh yeah, how do I know this person? Right. Oh yeah, SAC2 support work.
Well,
And so, you know, it was at their initiative getting in touch with us in the union. Certainly I didn't do anything to reach out to them.
Ken, do you have any recollection of your first meeting?
Well, we were formed in 1980, so the first major tour of BC was in 1981. And I remember then being invited back on many occasions to the CAIMAW Hall, where there would be Saturday workshops, various union educational programs. And that's when I met Cathy. I can almost remember doing that. Vague memories are indeed very, very vague. But it was at the CAIMAW Hall that I first met you, Cathy. And we, you know, we did the presentations. We always got a good response from Suckamore and the entire CAIMAW membership and activist crew. And so that then took off from there. CCU functions also, of course. And so I have a vague recollection, I may be totally wrong in this. Did we find a connection between Weiser Locke, your employer, and South Africa? I have this something in the back of my head saying, in our research, we came across something. Do you recall anything about that?
Could be. I'm afraid if you remember Weiser Law, there probably was some sort of connection. But no, I don't remember the details of that
Nor
at
do
all,
I.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
No, what I do remember is you coming and speaking at the CAIMAW Hall any number of times, and you were absolutely spellbinding. You know, it was just one of the best speakers that I'd ever heard. And I remember, I'm not much of an evening person at the best of times, and of course the meetings were nearly all in the evening. But boy, I never nodded off. I was just absolutely captivated, and just learned so much. Yeah, it was great, and everybody in the room was the same thing. I mean, you didn't have shuffling of chairs or people looking at notes or any side discussions. I mean, people were just absolutely captivated.
Well, as I said during the interview with Jeff Keithley and Laurel and John Lang, we never had to deal with the same politics when we dealt with the CCU that we had to deal with in terms of the CLC affiliates. And that's an important distinction to make. Back in those days, the CCU didn't have to worry about Cold War Union politics. It had its own position, and that was so much appreciated by people like ourselves who would go to BC and meet all the CCU affiliates and know that we weren't going to have to talk about, Cold War politics. It was quite refreshing.
Cathy, what do you credit that to?
Oh, the lack of Cold War politics, well, was the consequence of us forming an independent Canadian Union. I mean, we deliberately broke away from, in my case, the first union that people broke away from here in BC was the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And in their constitution, for example, it said you could not be a member of their union if you supported fascism, communism, or any other subversive ism. And that literally was in their constitution. So it was, and we definitely didn't want to be part of an American-based union. It was again part of the anti-imperialist struggle, and formed a Canadian Union, which was completely independent of not just the IBEW, but all sorts of other American unions. And of course, the so-called House of Labor, Canadian Labor Congress and BC Federation of Labor. We were not part of those organizations. So we were free to take decent positions on all sorts of issues, certainly including South Africa. We didn't have to worry about what those other guys thought or what the federal government thought. We could just do the right thing.
That's a very interesting perspective, and a tribute to all those folks that led that movement towards independent Canadian unionism. Jane?
Two things, Cathy. Do you remember any of the South Africans that we brought to CCU conventions or to the West Coast speaking?
Yes.
and how people responded?
Yeah, I remember both Peter Mashlangu and Bafo Nyanga, who we understand that was not his real name. Eventually we found that out. I can't remember what his real name is, but that's what we do him as. And they were also spellbinding speakers. And I remember just being fascinated, and like with Ken, they could talk at length in an incredibly interesting, fascinating way. And they didn't have notes. They never looked at a piece of paper, and they could just go on for such a long time. I remember just thinking that was absolutely marvelous. And so did everybody else in the room. It was a wonderful experience, and remember, that was, we still didn't have a lot of Black people in general, even in the Vancouver area. We're just getting over, racist immigration policies. I mean, not that we have a huge number now. It's nothing like Montreal, for example, but it was great. These guys coming and speaking to us about the situation in South Africa, and people were just absolutely captivated. It was terrific.
And how did that interest manifest itself as commitment and action on the part of the unions?
Well, I think there were two really fun things that I got to be involved in as a result of all of this. And one is I was a national representative looking after the workers in our local 12, CAIMAW local 12. And that was the Shelburne oil refinery workers. So needless to say, here's this campaign to, boycott Shell. And the Shell workers were saying, look, we can't exactly support a boycott of Shell because, this is where we work and we can't really boycott Shell. So what can we do? Because we've got to knock this issue on the head. So we decided that we would make a bargaining proposal, because we were in negotiations, that Shell should no longer import any product from South Africa into Canada. And at that stage, I think there was only, I don't know, some kind of plastic or something that was coming in, or feedstock for plastic or something. So it was sort of a symbolic thing, but an important thing to keep the issue on the table. And of course, one thing about Shell, I mean, they're all into this nonsensical sort of, we're really your best friend, and we don't believe in these confrontational, negotiations, and, we're going to listen to you, and, all of this stuff. So we, would go on at length about Shell in South Africa, and had a great opportunity to do so. And they would just sit there and bite their tongues and listen. And the irony of it was the guy who was the plant manager, who was the refinery manager in charge of negotiations, that's where he was from. And I can't remember if he was born, I think might have been born in Zimbabwe, but basically lived in South Africa and had been working for Shell there. So needless to say, he knew all this stuff intimately. And he just had to sort of sit there and take it. And, people were saying, eventually, how are we going to get an agreement? Because obviously Shell was, they might have to listen to us and, watch videos about it and put up with us. I said, well, we're never taking it off the table. If it doesn't show up in the final offer that people vote on, well, fair enough, but we're not taking it off the table. And everybody was completely supportive of that. We had a great local executive. So that was a lot of fun. And, you can, write articles in the union newsletter about it and, talk about it at local meetings about what we were doing. And we always had really good support.
That's a really privileged access to the mother lode of capital and all, that you can confront them so directly and bring it up. Normally we have to stand on the sidewalk in front of a gas station. That's amazing. Jane, I'm needing help here because I'm not so familiar with the BC scene or CCU or CAIMAW.
Cathy, were you also national rep with some of the mines? I'm just trying to remember, or was it via health and safety that you got involved with Mine Mill and some of the others? I have this vague recollection.
I represented as a national rep mines in BC, and in terms of health and safety, I looked after CAIMAW in terms of health and safety across the country, but of course CAIMAW only went as far as Manitoba. But within the CCU, had an opportunity to, speak at conferences and that sort of thing, and certainly did at my mill in Sudbury as well.
Ah, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You worry about your memory. I mean, the rest of us are all pretty similar.
boy,
in
oh,
terms
boy.
of, especially the 1980s, it seemed like, you know, you were just in the struggle 24/7 in one form or another.
Yeah. That's right.
Do you also, I don't know when exactly you were president of your local and then became a national rep, but do you remember in the earlier years in the 1980s, Zola Zembe coming out? Because we took him on tour out in 81, I think. It was.
Right. Yes. Thank you for reminding me about that. Yes, I do remember that. And I was, yeah, I started in 74 as the full-time
Okay.
local president. I started in factories in 70. So I was a national rep from, I don't know, 75 on. So yeah, no, I remember him. Yeah, well, again, you get reminded of names and such and speakers and oh yeah, what about him?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then in 86, was it 86 or 85 that we did the week of action? And there were actions down in the shipyards in Vancouver. I mean, the postal workers refused to handle mail, the airline workers refused to book flights, etc. Telephone workers were not taking calls. I mean, there were all sorts of actions, whatever people could do in their workplaces. Do you remember any of that? It was mid 80s.
Well, not in terms of me or our union. We didn't really, apart from Shell, we didn't have sort of that connection. Although, as Ken says, maybe with Weiser Locke. I'm sorry, I don't remember any relationship with Weiser, but maybe they had a facility in South Africa. I mean, it was an American company, and they certainly could have. So I you know, I remember, you know, the week of action, but I don't remember participating or doing anything in it.
All right.
Yeah.
No.
And again, that might have just been me. Maybe I was, you know, again, I could have been out of town servicing our mine locals then, because there was an awful lot of time spent in northern BC and central BC doing that too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right.
We all just lost Jess Suckamore recently. How important was it to have a really progressive president of CAIMAW and activist within the CCU executive to help this work move forward?
Oh, very important. Yeah, Jess was secretary treasurer of CAIMAW. And, you know, in a lot of respects, we were more like the British structure. So he was really the kingpin of the organization. And he was always really progressive and supportive. And if he hadn't been, it would have been very, you know, difficult, not impossible certainly, but difficult to move a progressive agenda ahead. But he was always supportive. And, you know, when Jeff Keithley was doing SACTU support work, you know, I mean, that was great. You know, in another organization, somebody might have said, oh, you're far too busy, you know, negotiating contracts. We can't have you, you know, off doing that kind of work. But he was just always supportive, which was terrific. And in his role in the CCU, and I think he really provided leadership there as well, because not all the CCU unions, well, they were great, obviously, on the independent Canadian Union issue. They weren't always necessarily as progressive on other social issues or political issues. So he really he stood out there in front, and I think it really helped bring everybody along.
You brought up from the period of your student days that there was a lot of action around Vietnam and Central and South America. Then at the union level, I'm wondering, was there spillover from the international solidarity across the line more or less to other countries and other situations? And also in terms of relations with our indigenous population, and for that matter, the role of women in the union and those kinds of struggles.
Well, in terms of international work, there was probably not a CAIMAW convention or a CCU convention or a BC Council of the CCU convention where we didn't pass at least one resolution in solidarity with workers somewhere. And, it often tended to be more, Central America or whatever, because, there was sort of some relationship. But, people were always encouraged to, to go to demonstrations in support of workers elsewhere and fights. I mean, it was, I remember attending some fairly teasy demonstrations, but, we'd be there anyway with our signs. And sent delegations to various places. I went to Nicaragua in '86, for example, and that was great. Now, anytime we went anywhere else, we paid for it ourselves. The union never paid for any of this. It was one of those things that you could never see any of these things as a boondoggle. It had to be you had to be committed to doing it. And around that time, CUSO had a project in Mozambique, and Ken Hansen, who was the president of our foundry local, went over and did some health and safety work there, and eventually stayed there. So that was great too. And later on, did some other work with Mozambique as well.
Oh.
Cathy, your passion for China certainly exceeds or matches our passion for South Africa, up to including this day. How would you discuss or assess international solidarity work now as compared with the time we're talking about in the 80s from the labor movement?
With China. Well, the first time I went to China was in '74. And fortunately, I was able to get time off work. I was working at Phillips Cables at the time. And that was a young workers delegation from Vancouver as part of the Canada-China Friendship Association. And at that time, I mean, they'll say now that was part of the Cultural Revolution. Well, it was over. But we were still very inspired by, a socialist China and, that whole different road. And then, of course, Deng Xiaoping took over in '78. So I basically didn't do anything with China for a long time. And then in '91, our former interpreter who'd been with us in '74, and he'd come over for several visits, was in Ottawa. He was actually the ambassador at the time. And he really said, listen, you should go back to China. I was there with my son at the time, and just see how things have changed. And I thought, oh darn it, Connell really needs to see. He was 11 at the time. He really needs to see a country where everybody's not as well off as us. And why not go to China? So we did, and didn't do any union work. I had one meeting with one fellow. And then nothing much happened until, the very early 2000s. And then delegations started coming over from China, from the All China Federation of Trade Unions. And of course, that was all in the context of China joining the WTO. And they said, holy cow, this is capitalism in the raw. This isn't just a little bit of Deng Xiaoping. This is a whole different kettle of fish. We better figure out, what it is you guys do. And at first, I sort of thought, well, is there any point, to these guys, they're real unions. And I met with Stephen Endicott, who was, of course, James Endicott's son, and very, had lived in China and was very much somebody who understood China. I said, is there any point in talking to these guys? Why should, is anybody really listening, or are they just coming over here on a trip? And he said, listen, if you don't talk to people, how are they ever going to learn about what's different? What you do in terms of how you organize workers, how you negotiate collective agreements, how you represent people at on the shop floor, because their only experience has been under, a previous structure where, the union helped to promote production and had model workers and, was building a socialist China. Now things have changed. So at any rate, so I did a lot of that. First, as part of the CAW, because I was in Ontario at the time. And then later on here with the Vancouver District Labour Council and BC Federation of Labor, there have been tons of delegations come through. And I've always done my best to try and make sure that people had presentations to them so that they would understand, what we do. It's not sort of, you have to do it this way, but this is what we do, and take from it what you may. Now, of course, with the incredible amount of China bashing, boy, it is an uphill battle to even think about communication, let alone what we might say. I find it actually staggering the way people are just snapping right back into Cold War stuff of, we shouldn't have anything to do with these guys, they're all run by the Communist Party, and, it's not a real Communist Party, and, so we shouldn't have anything to do with them. And it just is sort of a pale but awful reflection of Canadian foreign policy, which is, China is the biggest threat in the world right now. If you think Putin's bad, just wait till China starts invading other countries and such. So it's been tough. We had Kent Wong from the UCLA Labor Center, and he gave a talk, and people, it's interesting. People saw it as really defensive, and he was, but a lot of the stuff he was saying is similar stuff. You gotta talk to these guys if they're ever gonna have any opportunity for change. And when we did, certainly in the 2000s and into the last time I was actually there was 2015, but there've been delegations through since. It's interesting to see how much effect it does have on the Chinese unions. They started, the Beijing people were really very enthusiastic about electing workplace union leadership rather than just being appointed by the party. There were organizing drives at Walmart that started from, as we would do it, signing workers up rather than going in and telling the boss they have to have a union. And a lot of quite progressive stuff. And, and being introduced to people in various workplaces where they actually did already elect their bargaining committee and their union leadership and such. So, at this stage, I just sort of think, holy cow. I mean, I know they're not coming over here as delegations because of COVID, but, when they do start to gain, I sure hope that we just don't have to build it all right from the bottom again, that there'll be some interest on the part of some people in the union movement to at least talk to these guys. Because if they don't have any positive examples, what are they going to do? Come here and go sightseeing, or talk to the bosses. I mean, that's what they were starting to do, talking to the Ministry of Labor people because they would talk to them, and talking to employers organizations because they would talk to them. And it was a real bit of a persuasion issue to try and get unions to talk to them. But I think it really improved their work a lot and helped them out a lot when we did.
Wow, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Well, Jane, have you got any other issues or questions you'd like to bring up?
No.
These
Although Cathy, I remember you working to become fluent in Mandarin. She's self-taught.
amazing.
Wow.
It was a pretty pathetic attempt, but I did take it for a few years. Yeah.
I would pick up on one thing, Cathy. You said you wrote articles for your local newspaper, local union paper. Part of this project is to collect documentation of the solidarity work that we generated or that we helped to, facilitate. Would you possibly still have access to any of the things that you wrote about South Africa or SAC2 work?
For sure, I do not have any direct access at all. I don't have any of those union newsletters. There's two places, there may be some. One is Jess Suckamore may have squirreled these away in boxes. His daughter is still quite, I guess, upset about his passing. I mean, even though he was in poor health at the end, it was sort of, he went into the hospital and everybody thought he was going to come home and have a period of palliative care. And instead he died that night. And so she was pretty devastated. He'd been living with her since Grace died, his wife. And so that is certainly a possibility. And I will get in touch with Sandra and ask her if, I've already said, can I help with stuff, but I'll be specific about that.
That'd be very good.
It's theoretically possible that there is some of that in special collections at UBC. Possibly. I tend to think Jeff Keithley might have a better handle on that than me.
Yeah, and we talked to
and I
Jeff.
don't-
We talked to Jeff and Laurel and John Lang about all that. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it would have been in our well, no, by 80, certainly we would have had John Bowman with the CAIMAW review, right? So he may also, and he has a very good memory too. So he may have actually kept all of those. It's possible.
And I've
Because
spoken,
it was
I've
yeah.
spoken to John Bowman, and all of it is at UBC as far as I know. So hopefully we might be able to get Ken Trainer, who lives out on the West Coast, at some point to go and take a look at what's in the collection of, newspapers and paraphernalia, and maybe take images of articles that related to that period. One thing we have found, which has spurred us on, shall we say, with this project, is that what Doug referred to has been written by academics and articles, with rare exceptions, some in Canadian Dimension, etc. Most of it barely mentions the trade union movement, and almost without exception, they didn't talk to any trade unionists when they wrote about the trade union movement. And so there's a lot of inaccuracy, or they would mention a couple of paragraphs in a whole book about Canadian anti-apartheid work. There might be a page or two on the trade union movement. So it's kind of spurred us on, because we know how much happened coast to coast, and trying to find where that has gotten documented has been a bit of a challenge. But Jeff did send a package just recently off to us. We have a collection point, and we're planning on doing another deposit with whatever photographs and other materials we can collect this fall, along with we've done about 15, I'm guessing, of these oral histories, which we are also depositing. So we're working away at it, but it's a bit of a detective story trying to locate.
Well, if you do have that chance, Cathy, it would be much appreciated if you could talk with your friend and try to,
especially with Sandra, yes.
see if she has it. Not to pressure. It's not pressure at all. But the trick with the Library and Archives Canada is that it come through this little sort of collective we've got going here, the SAC2 Solidarity Committee alumni, we're calling them, because they're registered with all these documents at Library and Archives Canada. But if somebody sends them individually, they get registered to Doug Miller or Cathy Walker or whoever,
Yeah.
So we appreciate it if you could help us with, and it can be photocopies and whatever, from
Yeah.
your phone, even JPEG.
Yeah.
So,
I will do that for sure. Yeah.
All right,
well,
terrific.
I want to say thank you on my behalf, and I'm sure Ken and Jane can do it on their own as well. But I think it was great to hear the stories, and the analysis is bringing the picture into a much bigger scene. As Jane says, we realize how important the unions are, but how underrated their efforts were. So it's great to get these stories, and thank you so much for your contribution.
Can I tell you one more story?
Oh, absolutely, please. Often the stories
Okay.
come out when we
Well,
turn off the record button.
this is when we're, so I'm in Ottawa and I'm there for meetings, health and safety meetings. And this is 1990. So we're not actually in the CLC yet, but things are thawing a little bit. So they would let me show up for health and safety and meetings when we're talking about important issues. So this time I decide, okay, I'm gonna take my son because he's never been to Ottawa. He was 10 at the time. And, there's interesting places for him to see. And I can't remember if I was staying with Patty DeLine or, I can't quite remember the details, but anyway, she might have wound up looking after him when I was at meetings. So we're meeting, of course, we went over and had our session with the Chinese ambassador where he suggested we go to China, which we did the following year. But the other thing that happened is that was when Nelson Mandela came to Canada for the first time. And we went out to the airport, Connell and I, because I said, listen, this is, the chance of a lifetime. I said, I don't know if we'll even get a glimpse of him. But we took the bus out. And of course, we get there and there's like 10 million people. Well, not, I exaggerate, but there was a whole lot of people, even though it had not been well advertised. And Connell had on this great T-shirt, which he actually wore sort of as a to bed at night because it was enormous. And it had this huge picture of Nelson Mandela on the front. So we're way at the back. And of course, we can't see a darn thing. So I said to Connell, I said, listen, they'll let a little kid wiggle their way to the front. I said, I can't get through, but you just go through and say, excuse me, and just go through to the front and you'll be able to see what's going on. So, who does he see? Of course, the Prime Minister shakes his hand. That was Mulroney. And then Joe Clark shakes his hand, says, this is how he reports to me afterwards, said, how are you? And Connell, before he could answer, Joe Clark just moves on. And then Nelson Mandela shakes his hand. And of course, he's quite pleased to see this little kid with this enormous T-shirt on with his picture on it. And then Winnie Mandela is next and says, oh, and how are you? And he was able to summon the courage to say, well, I'm fine, thank you. Because she stood there and listened to his answer. And that was his story, which of course I didn't see any of this. I mean, this was all happening way in front. And it was only when the crowd finally dispersed and we found each other again that he told me all of this. And, it was all this great SACTU work. I'm sure I would have never had this great T-shirt if it wasn't for SACTU. And it was just one of those experiences he'll remember his whole life. And it was just such a great opportunity. And one of those things that, it's just a lovely memory. So now you can say thank you, Doug. Yes. And, yeah. And it's just a real treat. Yeah, real treat to reminisce.
Oh, I bet you those memories are very much alive for him.
Yeah, they are for sure.
Yeah.
Great to see you, Cathy. Keep well.
Okay, lovely to see you guys too. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Have a good day.